All right. Well, thank you everyone for joining our event today. My name is Jason Grillo with Air Miners. It's a pleasure to see you all here for our event on building an MRV ecosystem. So the letters MR and V mean something very special in carbon removal world. It means measurement, reporting, and verification. But it's also very much the underpinning of what we're achieving in carbon removal, regardless of the method of removing greenhouse gas from the atmosphere, knowing that we're on a journey in air miners to remove the first billion tons of CO2 from the atmosphere. We want to do that by the end of 2030. So time's a wasting. And the sooner we can get the ability to measure, report, and verify with the greatest degree of trust and verify and credibility that we can achieve, that is going to be what drives the industry forward. It's very much the underpinning of carbon removal, that we are doing what we are doing, in fact. So with that in mind, we have a event today outlining what building that ecosystem is all about. And we have some esteemed panelists, and Rick Berg is our moderator, and we'll get to them in a minute. What I want to do now is just outline some logistics for today. As we typically do in Air Miners, we're going to have our panel discussion for about 35 or 40 minutes, and then open it up to you to ask your own questions as an audience. As we go along, feel free to put your questions into the Zoom chat. I will monitor that and then elevate folks to ask their questions when it comes to Q&A time. I will close at the top of the hour and then stop the recording. This will be up on our YouTube channel if you can't make it the whole time. So it'll be up in a couple of days. After we get done with the main part of our presentation today, of our meeting today, we will have a 30-minute networking session. So I'll leave the Zoom chat open for people to hang around and keep on talking about what we just learned about and discuss the ideas that came up in conversation among the speakers today. So feel free to hang around for that. Don't feel obligated to. Goodness knows everybody's extraordinarily busy working to remove greenhouse gas from the atmosphere. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to stop talking, which I'm sure you'll all appreciate, and leave the stage to Rick Berg from NORI to introduce himself, and then we'll go to our panelists. So Rick, please take it away.
Great. Thank you, Jason, and thank you everybody for joining. My name is Rick Berg. I'm Director of Methodology at NORI, Carbon Removal Marketplace. And so as Jason said, I'll be moderating today, but where I can, I'll also be joining the conversation to add in input wherever I think, I might have some perspective here or there. So with that, I will hand it off to our panel members to introduce themselves, and we can start with Freya.
Sure. Excited to be here. Great to see a lot of familiar faces. I'm Freya Chay. I lead the carbon removal program at a research nonprofit called Carbon Plan. Broadly, we are interested in supporting integrity and transparency of climate solutions, including carbon removal. We want to help people do more stuff that works and less stuff that doesn't. And a very clear intersection for us in carbon removal is around MRV, which is how we tell what is working. Alicia, can I hand it off to you?
Sure. Hello, everyone. My name is Alicia Karspeck. Thanks so much to Jason and Rick for the invitation to be here today. I'm also seeing a lot of familiar faces, which is wonderful. So I'm one of the co-founders and the chief technology officer at a nonprofit research organization called Seaworthy. C there is C within brackets for carbon. And we are kind of a unique organization in that we are a group of oceanographic and biogeochemical scientists who have come together for the purpose of actually creating some of the software tools that are needed to do the quantification of ocean-based carbon dioxide removal. So here in this conversation, I'm going to be playing a specific role of helping think through the kind of case studies around what the MRV question means for this emerging industry in the ocean CDR space and more broadly in kind of the open systems space.
Great. So to give everyone kind of an overview of what to expect here, we got a lot of input from you all on what kind of your interests are and such, and we'll be basing the conversation largely on that. So we have, I have some questions, some setup questions for Alicia and Freya, and we'll get to those. But I imagine the conversation can flow freely as well. We'll see where it goes. And with that, we can start. And let's, Freya, let's start with you. Can you set the stage for us here? So what is an MRV ecosystem, and where as an industry are we in their development?
Yeah, lots of terminology here and lots of different actors. Maybe just starting with the term MRV. You might see it as measurement, reporting, and verification, or monitoring, reporting, and verification. Essentially, I think of MRV as a system to develop trustworthy quantifications of outcomes that we care about. We're often talking about this in the context of carbon markets, creating trustworthy credits, but MRV is broader than that. It can support a number of goals, one of which could be carbon credits. In the context of an MRV ecosystem supporting carbon credit generation, I think we can kind of differentiate between how the ecosystem has traditionally looked in the kind of conventional voluntary carbon market and how it's evolving for the emerging long duration carbon removal market. So historically, if we talk about the ecosystem of actors in the conventional market, really a center role has been the registry. These are organizations like Verra or Gold Standard or Climate Action Reserve who are responsible for developing the rules by which you get credits, issuing credits, and maintaining a ledger of how credits have been issued and how they have been retired through time. Those registries historically develop both standards, which are kind of higher level rules about how you interact with their crediting program, as well as methodologies or protocols, which are more detailed rules about how you actually calculate the climate benefits that generate from a certain type of project. In addition to the registry playing the central role, you'll hear about verifiers. Verifiers conventionally have played a somewhat narrow role. Their role has been to go out and make sure that projects have checked the boxes of the rules. They are not asking whether the rules are right, whether the protocols are capturing accurately carbon removal outcomes or other outcomes. They are just checking, did project X follow the rules they need to get the credits? In addition to those actors, there are a number of kind of higher level standards that might come into play, but I'm going to kind of set those aside for the time being. Although they shape the MRV ecosystem, bodies like ICVCM or ICROA, by setting out standards about what they require for credits to meet their bar, I think we can kind of set them aside for the kind of very practical conversation of how MRV happens. In the emerging ecosystem, I would say one really interesting thing is that it's still not clear whether it's going to look like the old ecosystem or whether it's going to look really different. So you have some of these conventional registries just starting to think about long duration carbon removal, but most of the activity thus far has happened outside of their purview. At the beginning, a lot of deals and a lot of MRV expectations were being set just via a negotiation between projects and buyers, kind of front wave buyers who had strong opinions about trustworthy quantification and what that needed to look like for different pathways. That is still happening, but you have also seen some new registries emerge, actors like Puro or Isometric, who are iterating a little bit on the business model of how a registry works and what incentives they have, but are playing a similar role of developing protocols, issuing credits, and keeping a ledger of where those credits end up. I think another really interesting kind of emerging set of actors for CDR, long duration CDR MRV, is this set of nonprofit actors that is springing up to fill gaps. Seaworthy is one, and I'll let Alicia speak to that. They are like really developing tools that are missing. You also see nonprofits like Cascade, which is stepping in right now to think about building consensus around enhanced weathering MRV standards. You have actors like Carbon to Sea. I see some representation on the call from them who are, supporting the ecosystem of MRV development in other ways via R&D and creating opportunities for people to really test out what works. You have actors like Circe, run by Anu Khan, who is thinking about like organizing the whole world of MRV and starting to think about like, how does MRV change if you're doing it for the government instead of the carbon market? So there's really new, interesting set of organizations that are responding to maybe some of the unique needs of long duration CDR that we can talk more about. And last, I would say, the government is a really important part of the MRV ecosystem. Right now, you're seeing, for instance, the US Department of Energy become a buyer of CDR, and de facto, the stance that they take about many of these questions will become a strong influence on what good enough MRV looks like. Similarly, in Europe, you have the development of protocols via the CRCF. So this really interesting emerging role from governments starting to think about what rigorous quantification for carbon removal looks like through their eyes. That's a lot of actors, so I'll pause there.
That is a lot of actors. One common thread throughout that I think becomes obvious is there's a lot of emerging actors. There's a lot of new things happening. So I think kind of more setting the stage here, it's probably going to be a common theme that none of this is completely worked out yet, especially for the durable CDR kind of methods. And along those lines, Alicia, you with Seaworthy are working on this within marine CDR. So kind of as a case example for a lot of the things that Freya just talked about, what are the components of the MRV ecosystem for marine CDR that Seaworthy is addressing, and who are the other players that you're interacting with?
Yeah, thanks. It's a great question, and I appreciate you taking that first one, Freya, because there's a lot of information there. So I want to just add a little bit into the way that certainly at Seaworthy we think about this defining what a sort of a healthy ecosystem looks like for MCDR. As Freya pointed out, and this is certainly true for marine carbon dioxide removal and also all open systems CDR, is that there's a lot of attention that needs to be placed towards this question of whether or not carbon removal claims are real, right? This is an really important part of MRV is, are we actually removing the carbon that we're saying we're removing and then selling as through carbon markets? So I would say that's sort of the number one thing that we think about around MRV in the ocean-based CDR, as well as sort of the broader markets. The other thing that we think about a lot within the ocean CDR space is making sure that we're also creating an enabling environment for the development of a robust and trustworthy ocean CDR industry. And what that looks like in practice as it relates to MRV is that we're not creating MRV systems which are actually too complex to actually in practice for practitioners to actually achieve the type of uncertainties that we want, but instead that we're sort of thinking about ways in which we can do that quantification in a way that allows the industry to move forward. So these two issues can sometimes seem in tension, but we have to think about doing those two things together for this type of emerging market. The other thing to keep in mind for most open systems, this is certainly true for ocean CDR, is that a lot of the science in terms of how we do that MRV, some of the basic research into how we should be doing that MRV and that quantification is still in progress right now. So a really, really key part of the ecosystem for MCDR is researchers and fundamental scientists who are entering this space knowing that there are sort of core questions that need to be answered now and will likely continue need to be answered in the next 10 years, maybe even longer than that. So let me talk about the role that we play here at Seaworthy and then some of the other folks that we interact with. So as I mentioned in the introduction, we're sort of a unique organization in the sense that we are focusing on building the open source tools that are needed for MCDR quantification. And so sort of inside of that is already this pretty big claim, which is that models are an important part of the quantification process for MCDR. We are at our organization, folks that have all come out of academic backgrounds. We are oceanographers, ocean modelers, and biogeochemists. And our central thesis is that basically these tools that are needed for this process of doing MRV have been developed over decades within the public domain by the academic and scientific communities. And so we have this opportunity now to actually use those to make them fit for purpose for this particular problem. So we really focus on this kind of the creation, making sure that there are tools available for doing the MRV, at least the modeling component of that for this emerging industry. That's our core role at Seaworthy. Of course, even though that's a core technical problem, we interact with all sorts of other actors within the MCDR ecosystem. So I'll just name a few, and they're going to just sound a lot like what Freya just mentioned. There are, of course, a number of companies who are trying to actually offer commercial services around doing some of the modeling and also the measurement work that's necessary for ocean-based CDR. Those companies, I think it's been a tough road for a lot of those companies, and there's not a whole lot of them in the marketplace right now. So there's actually a limited supply of independent third-party MRV companies in the ocean-based CDR space. We work a lot with and are in a lot of communication with buyers. So in the MCDR space, these are mostly catalytic buyers. So these are buyers of credits who are mostly invested in the concept of actually accelerating the growth of the industry as opposed to really thinking about compensatory claims. So that's actually that's great news in terms of spurring fundamental research. These buyers are really playing an important role right now in the ecosystem, both as sort of catalyzing the growth of the industry, but then also as being sort of the first line in terms of an insistence on a high quality MRV process. So as Freya pointed out, there's a lot of concern within the MCDR industry of not repeating some of the problems that happened with the terrestrial markets. And so the buyers who are in this space are really that front line in terms of holding the line in terms of what is considered high quality MRV. Suppliers right now. So of course there's a dozen or so and growing number of, so maybe more like 20 MCDR suppliers right now. Most of them are commercial companies. And the reality is that they are doing the lion's share of their MRV at this moment. So again, we have aspirations, I think, within our ecosystem of having third-party MRV providers. But right now, there's a lot of bespoke technology that's being deployed, and these methodologies are relatively new. And so there's a lot of the MRVs actually being designed and done by the companies themselves. As Freya pointed out, of course, registries are an important part of this, especially in the open system space. There's the development of these protocols and potentially the development of higher level standards that can help guide the way that the MRV should take place within the MCDR market. I'll mention a couple more roles that the government is playing that Freya didn't mention. So the government, of course, plays a really important role in terms of funding and doing fundamental scientific research into the ocean and the ocean biogeochemical system. And that is a key part of the ecosystem at this moment in time because the science is still evolving. The government is also, of course, acting in the regulatory, in a regulatory environment. So making decisions about permitting, for example. Permitting is a really important part of the ecosystem of MRV for ocean CDR because there are strong permitting regimes and regulatory regimes that cover the ocean. You really can't think about an MRV system without also thinking about the ways that we need to do monitoring for the purpose of ecosystem safety and also for staying within existing permits. And then, of course, as Freya pointed out, we work closely with other nonprofits in this space. We, of course, are a nonprofit that focuses on a technical vision of, an important piece of this, which needs to be the development of this technology for quantification. But then there are a number of organizations who are also playing the role as field builders. And so these are folks which are focusing more on creating that enabling environment for this ecosystem to grow and thrive. And Freya already mentioned a number of those important players within the open systems space. So I think just to echo what Freya said as well, for the MCDR space, how all these pieces fit together is still a work in progress. I think we look at the traditional markets and the way that MRV has been and that ecosystem has evolved as being kind of a starting point and a kind of an inspiration that we can think about iterating towards something that works better for the MCDR marketplace and creates more trustworthiness within the markets.
Yeah, from a market perspective, coming from a place of trust is really the top priority, especially in this early VCM where the standards, like we've been saying, are not fully set yet. So to be as transparent as possible is critical for trust in the market and for the development of all of these standards. That's certainly what we're seeing. And so Alicia, there's a lot of threads that we can pull on out of everything that you just talked about there. The first one that I think I'd like to pull on, I'll ask Freya. So, and this relates to buyers and kind of how buyers should be thinking about operating in this early stage market. So how should those buyers be thinking about, offtake agreements or pre-purchases from companies that are still working out MRV details? And this question was largely from the audience here. Some folks were asking about this, where, these things are still in development, but people need funding, and a lot of that funding needs to come from offtake agreements or pre-purchases.
It's a really good question. I think there are a couple of different levers. One, I think, the claims that buyers want to make about the credits they are using, I think can really change your expectations about how confidently MRV needs to produce a perfect ton. So if you are a buyer trying to make a compensatory claim, say I bought X tons and offset X tons of CO2 fossil emissions, I think the bar for MRV confidence needs to be quite different, or your capacity for being able to sit with uncertainty about still figuring things out might need to be quite different than if you are willing to say, like, I am mainly interested in supporting innovation and we can figure this out together as we go. I think that differentiation, for instance, is demonstrated within Frontier, which is a large advanced market commitment buying permanent carbon removal. And they have two tracks. They have an offtake agreement track and they have a pre-purchase track. So thinking about the claims you want to make as a buyer can create more space for kind of co-learning about MRV through the process. I think there's also some interesting thinking and innovation being done around, cadences of kind of ratcheting up MRV. And some of that is being kind of experimented with by leading buyers who are actually baking terms into their contracts. And I think another thing you can think about is just the likely rate of change for a pathway and the duration of your offtake agreement. So levers you can play with, but fully recognize that especially for the pathways that we are still like deep in the learning process around, this is a really tricky challenge. How do we not enshrine standards that like 5 years down the road will be really outdated and clearly not producing rigorous outcomes based on our evolving scientific understanding?
Yeah, and it's critical again, from the marketplace perspective, the early stage MRV for us, I guess the bottom line is the main thing we need are uncertainty estimates. As long as there are uncertainty estimates, crediting can happen to some degree, as long as those uncertainty estimates aren't wildly below zero or something like that. So the MRV in that sense, from a crediting perspective, it plays the core role that supports everything else in terms of uncertainty deductions for credit issuance, in terms of the what we do about reversals, what kind of mechanisms we put in place, whether that's buffer pool or insurance mechanisms, which are really interesting emerging trend right now as well, these different carbon insurance companies and the mechanisms that we can put into place there. And then also, leakage or emission displacement, which by definition falls outside of the kind of project boundaries, and this outside of the MRV, kind of what, how might that affect it, and how might development of better MRV, address those things that we can't address right now. The other thing that's I think was mentioned was third-party actors, and a lot of these companies are having to do their own MRV. They're having to develop their own MRV and do it. And there are some companies that are focusing only on MRV and providing those services for companies, but there's not a lot of them out there. So for Alicia, I guess I'll ask you. So a lot of these companies are having developed their own MRV simply because there's a lack of third-party service providers out there. So how do you see that dynamic evolving in the coming years? Or should folks with novel solutions that don't have MRV developed already just expect to continue to face that challenge for the foreseeable future?
So I think that's a great question. I want to just follow up before answering that to the previous question, and then I'll get to that around this question of what buyers want. Now, I'm not a buyer, so I can't speak on behalf of all buyers, but we have quite a few conversations with catalytic buyers in the MCDR space. And one of the things that is very clear in those conversations is that there is a strong desire from them for kind of a unified perspective from the scientific community about what constitutes sort of a high quality open systems CDR. So how do we understand whether a ton has actually been removed, and it's been removed durably? In a desire for that, what that naturally leads to is a reaching out into the scientific community. So an important piece of this ecosystem right now at this point is actually academics who are being called upon to opine on what their viewpoint is on what quality MRV looks like, right? So there's this kind of ongoing appetite for the resolution of some of the uncertainties about the right way to do open systems MRV on behalf of buyers. That creates a situation that is actually quite complex for suppliers. So suppliers in the MCDR space around MRV are in a really tough place at this moment in time, because there are really almost no third-party MRV companies to turn to. So they're sort of doing that on their own. That's getting to your question. And then also they are needing to really negotiate, I think, in a very skillful way with these buyers who themselves are very sophisticated from the perspective of scientifically sophisticated, and are really holding a high bar. So I've been thinking a lot about what can we do, I think, as a community to help some of these suppliers work through this difficult moment in time where there's a lot of uncertainty, and yet there's still this desire to move forward. A couple of things I'll point out. So one is just to sort of validate that this is a really tough time for them, and that there are in MCDR right now, there really are not these standards for them to operate within, and there's a process by which we are trying to come up with what those standards are. Buyers understand this, the ones that are sophisticated and catalytic, they understand this. And so what's really needed in terms of this discussion of MRV for the suppliers right now is a lot of transparency. And so what transparency looks like here is not just data transparency, but when talking about and then publishing their methodologies, being very verbose, like talking all about exactly what they're doing, really being open about the challenges around open systems MRV that they're experiencing for in their particular project, operating with a level of humility, which means that, look, scientists around the world do not know the answer right now for the perfect way to do MCDR MRV. Buyers know that, suppliers know that, and the more we can just speak openly about that and be contributors within our MRV methodologies, the better off we are. The other thing I think that's really important here for suppliers as they're writing their methodologies and thinking about that is to adopt a stance of resourcefulness, in the sense that suppliers right now are doing a lot of the basic research, right? So we often think, oh, research just sits within an academic sphere or national labs, but in fact, a lot of these commercial companies who are suppliers are doing some of the basic research, and they are being resourceful in terms of coming up with some of the first order solutions around what may become in the future standard MRV practices. So I think that, again, suppliers should be really open about that resourcefulness and the ways that they are working to try to solve these really difficult problems. To your question directly, Rick, I think that there probably should realistically be a expectation that suppliers will continue to play a really important role for the next few years in terms of doing their own, at least a good portion of their own MRV. I think we want to start to transition that into being something that either third-party actors can do, or that there are more robust standards that are guiding that. And, you know, there is an effort, it's very nascent at this point, amongst some of the nonprofits in this space to try to come up with some better guidance in terms of MCDR standards. And the goal there, of course, then is to take some of that weight off of these suppliers to have to do all of this work, which is really consensus building science work, without actually having the help of the scientific community, which they really need at this point. So it's a challenging point in time. And I think those of us, again, in the nonprofit space, we are aware of this, buyers are aware of this, and there is this working forward towards sort of a better situation for MRV for MCDR companies.
Yeah, the need for transparency is again just critical in this early stage market. You know, you mentioned something that just struck me. You brought up the fact that it's really consensus building stage right now for a lot of this science and technology and the application of the technology. I'm curious from Freya or from either of you around transparency and the need for it in this consensus building. In what ways can MRV systems be designed to enhance transparency and accessibility of the information that is being provided for all stakeholders involved?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, great question. I mean, I think transparency is so interesting because it can play a lot of different roles. I think, you know, historically, transparency in the voluntary carbon market has largely been about facilitating oversight. And I would say, you know, we haven't done a fantastic job of that. You know, if you look at the forest carbon market space, for instance, it's not even possible to find where exactly in the world most forest offset projects are, which would be critical if you wanted to do third-party oversight about the claims around forest growth. Like, those shape files just don't exist. So I think a lesson there is, for the purposes of trustworthiness cultivated by the ability for third parties to come in and say, yeah, this makes sense, really thinking about the critical pieces of information that are just fundamental to someone's ability to kind of check your math, is like foundational. But I think there's this other role that transparency is playing in long duration CDR, which is we are all still learning. And I think that's really obvious in open systems, but it's also true for closed systems. I think a really good example is, we are not sure what the rules should be or the secondary market impacts are when we source different kinds of biomass. We are not yet sure how exactly we should account for energy use and the impacts of using renewable energy for CDR when you are grid connected. Like, those are some kind of open system flavored questions that really relate to these closed system pathways that have easy MRV, but they are still being negotiated. So I think the other role that transparency plays is really one of supporting learning. And historically, that has not been a very clear stated goal of MRV and carbon markets, but I think it has to be central to how we're thinking about developing these MRV systems. How do we help projects learn such that they are improving their operations? And how do we create the information needed to do the system level work, the system level modeling to close big uncertainty gaps that projects are not going to be able to close themselves? Registries certainly play a role in terms of collecting, centralizing, and making public project data. I don't think that's the only way we can think about it. I think we can also think about how buyers might demand or expect data sharing as part of what is produced from a pre-purchase or an offtake. I think we can do a better job defining where we need data to close key system uncertainties and building community efforts around centralizing that data and contributing from projects. But yeah, I think fundamentally your question is one that's still being answered, but it is central to the project of CDR right now and MRV, which is how do we harness MRV to help us all learn? I think that could take a lot of shapes.
Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead, Alicia.
Oh, I just wanted to add something, maybe a very specific example of that, of something that we are thinking a lot about Seaworthy, and I think is more generally for MCDR. So back to what, Freya mentioned this point about earlier about, what is all the information that you need to save to actually make sure that a credit is auditable? And, usually when we talk about data in that way, we have a tendency, I think, to think about that as observational data, measurement data. And of course, when we get into the open system space, especially MCDR, the data that we think about in terms of being able to tell whether carbon has been removed is actually model-based data in many cases. And model-based data, for those of you, we use the word model to mean a lot of things. So let me just be a little more specific here. In the MCDR space, we run oceanographic models and ocean biogeochemical models. So these are models that are modeling the circulation of the ocean, temperature, salinity of the ocean. They are also modeling the carbonate chemistry of the system. So the amount of data that comes out of these modeling simulations is enormous. We're talking about terabytes and terabytes of information. So the question about whether or not a company is somehow going to make that information available and transparent is one that actually becomes very practical very quickly, and is not just about whether or not we believe in the ethos of transparency. One of the things that we've been thinking a lot about at Seaworthy is this question of how do you make modeling simulations, which for MCDR are going to be actually core to how we do that quantification. How do we make those simulations auditable? And what that means is thinking through all of the, I'll call it metadata, but the metadata that is used to define what our modeling simulations look like. And examples of this is, what is, for example, the version of the model that you use? What is the boundary forcing that you happen to use for that? What is the resolution of the grid that you use for that? This whole set of information that actually defines what this kind of modeling simulation looks like, that then actually computes what the amount of carbon uptake is. So there's an entire space, I think it's kind of worth thinking about, that's certainly emerging in the MCDR markets, maybe in others as well, about thinking through where this information ends up getting stored and in what format it gets stored. Are there companies that need to form themselves around holding this types of information such that it can be audited in the future?
Bottom line, there's a lot of work to do still. So this 35 minutes went by far too fast, but we are there. And so I will now hand it off to Jason, who says he's got some good questions teed up from the audience here.
Awesome. Thank you, Rick. And thanks, Freya and Alicia, for a really excellent conversation. I will say, too, that the Zoom chat has some extraordinarily rich questions that regrettably we're not going to have time to get to everybody, but as best we can, we'll ask. First person is Ray Attridge. Ray, if you are on, I have a question about community attributes for MRV.
Hi, can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Hello.
Yes, please go ahead, Ray. Ray? Oh, sorry. It looks like Ray's having some audio issues right now. I can paraphrase her question here, which is, can you comment on the climate, community, and biodiversity side of MRV?
Did you say climate, community, and what? Biodiversity?
Biodiversity, yes.
Hi, sorry, I'm back.
Hey.
Hi, sorry. My signal is quite bad. But I am just very interested in the CCB verifications that I've only read up on the Vera website. And I think we can all sort of agree that it's very difficult just to quantify carbon sequestration. And so the qualitative data that comes from the social impact that these types of projects have is a whole nother storm to deal with. But I was wondering if you had any sort of insights or if there's any open tools that address that type of work when it comes to carbon dioxide removal. Yeah.
Thanks, Ray.
I can maybe take a first stab. Maybe stepping back from your question about tools, I think it's really interesting. There's ambiguity when we use this term MRV about whether it's just about carbon or whether we're defining some broader set of outcomes that we are interested in characterizing. And that is a function of just how we decide and write down what we care about to quantify. So MRV could be very carbon-centric, or it could be inclusive of other ecosystem or community outcomes. When we think about starting to develop those, I just think there's so much room for improvement. I don't think the track record in the conventional voluntary carbon market is that great to really map on the ground outcomes to claimed, sustainable development goal checkboxes. I think there's some really interesting conversations happening right now about how to engage communities on a case-by-case basis and figuring out what do they want to know about the project. That's probably not carbon related. It could be about water quality. It could be about environmental outcomes, key species. I think that's a very interesting thread of conversation. It's early, it's ongoing. It will likely be case specific. I think there are also some really interesting conversations about the importance of quantifying co-benefits, which is often kind of put to the wayside. But again, in terms of the long-term viability of CDR in general, understanding co-benefits like agricultural benefits or air quality benefits or anti-ocean acidification in local areas could be a really important piece of the political and narrative puzzle for making these things work. Should we include that in the definition of MRV? And last but not least, for many of these pathways, we're still, as Alicia has really, I think, nicely kind of hammered home, we are still learning. We're not sure what to measure. Like when we're thinking about MCDR, like what ecosystem characteristics are you measuring where, for which different pathways? Yeah, again, deep in the learning phase. Alicia, what would you add?
Yeah, let me add something about this. I agree with everything that Freya said, and just want to hammer on this sort of point of, in my view, how important it really is to have clarity in the separation between the way that we think about MRV from a carbon quantification uptake, the quantification of a carbon uptake, versus any of the other pieces of that we might care about, community impacts, ecosystem impacts, et cetera. The reason that I would say that that's so important is one that Freya hasn't quite mentioned yet, which has to do with just reminding ourselves over and over again that about the reason that we're doing this. So an important reason we're doing this, all of this really has to do with a desire to actually remove carbon from the atmosphere. We need to know how much carbon we are removing from the atmosphere as a collective. So it's not just important on the project scale. Of course, that is important from the market mechanism perspective. But as scientists and as citizens, what we really care about here is the collective action of carbon dioxide removal. The way that we understand that collective action actually is by quantifying it point by point, by project, so that we can start to actually understand how much we think from the bottom up we have removed from this process. Scientists, climate scientists in general, who think about closing the global carbon budget, they have their own mechanisms for trying to understand how much carbon is going in and out of the ocean or the terrestrial systems. And those are top-down pieces of information that we need to marry with this information that we're generating in terms of carbon removal. So again, keeping our eye, it's not to say that these other pieces of MRV are not important as well. They are oftentimes, if we can't get them right, we won't be able to do these projects, so that they're very important. But we also need to think about this quantification from the perspective that we need to be reporting this information and find mechanisms to report this information collectively up into the scientific body that actually computes global carbon budgets.
Excuse
Thank
me,
you.
do you mind if I say,
Oh.
Hi, Jason.
Hey, Daniel. Quickly,
Hey.
please.
Yes. I have seen a lot of work with bringing a sheep into the solar sites, and I've participated in some discussions with the American Solar Grazing Association. They've conducted studies that show that the rotational grazing of the sheep promotes carbon in the soil.
Yeah. Daniel.
And yes, sorry.
Yeah, so thank you. Could you, real quickly,
No problem.
because we
Sure.
have a couple of the people who waited in the queue. Sorry.
Yeah, sorry. I'll mute myself. Sorry, I'll.
Sure. Sorry about that, Daniel. So next up we have Seth Sternberg.
Hey, thank you for a great talk. Alicia, I think this is a very interesting follow on from your comments about taking that system-wide view. And so my question is, looking at some of the more established pathways, and as other pathways start to mature and they get these established protocols, how much room is there for innovation around the MRV within those protocols? And then going forward, do you see that as a way for companies to differentiate themselves, or is it going to be more important to really heavily standardize and build that systemic trust?
You want me to take a stab at it? I'm sure we both Freya and I have viewpoints on this. I think it's such a great question. I'd say at this moment in time, and we debate this a lot certainly within Seaworthy and then with some of our broader partners, about this tension that exists between wanting to standardize the MRV process versus to sort of make sure that there's room for that to continue to innovate. So a couple of points around this is that there is no question in my mind that that MRV standards for MCDR, of course, I'm just talking about MCDR here, will be evolving over time. And when I say over time, they could be evolving for the next decade. It could be 2 decades, right? We have a long path ahead of us towards more and more deeply understanding the right way to do the quantification within open systems. That being said, there is an absolute necessity, I would say, at this moment in time to make agreements amongst the scientific community and also the business community around standards, right? So that we actually are able to operate, that there can be companies that are operating. I think there's a great term that the executive director of Carbon to Sea actually used, which is we need to start thinking less about uncertainty reduction and more about ambiguity reduction. And the concept there is that we say we can all collectively agree about the way that we can do MRV at this moment, while knowing that the standards that we use to do that will be evolving over time. All standards that exist within the MCDR space right now, we should expect that they will be evolving over time.
Yeah, Seth, I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on your own question. I think for more established pathways, my instinct, although this is not something that I have a strongly held opinion on, is that hopefully in 10 years we're not thinking about MRV, we're not talking about MRV. MRV is operating under the hood if you have performance-based standards and some minimum bars that we think are rigorous, and you can innovate on top of those and reduce your costs of compliance. Fantastic. I think there are some challenges there, especially when you start talking about pathways that rely more on models, to start talking about who needs to have what expertise to be able to verify which tools that go above and beyond or meet a performance-based standards. I think that ecosystem does not exist yet, and so we end up being very prescriptive. But yeah, if you have any hot takes, I'd be curious to hear them.
No, nothing too hot. I mean, my feeling is that you've got to have that innovation, right? Especially with so many of these companies being venture backed, that you need to have that innovation and differentiation under the aegis of whatever bars we set.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Yeah.
I think in the chat, Pam Chu actually had a comment, which I think is important, that ideally this is all performance based and technology agnostic.
Yeah.
Which does leave that.
I also do think, something I've been thinking a lot about, and we'll bring in here at the final bell, is the reality that right now we all assume that these technologies are primarily going to be deployed in a market context, and we are designing MRV as such. But I think that's a huge question that we should all think more about. Especially for something like enhanced weathering. Is there a world where, pay for practice agricultural incentives for those co-benefits plus some sort of regional or system level MRV is actually a more logical and efficient path forward? And that brings up, different scientific questions, different incentive questions, different questions about innovation. Yeah, so I guess frame of reference maybe also plays a role in answering your question, and that's something that I would like to hear a lot more curiosity and conversation about.
Thank you.
Great. We only have 5 minutes left, so time for one more quick question with hopefully quickish answers. Then we'll conclude it so that people can be off on the day. Kian Hadif, please.
Yeah, sure. I'll try to keep it brief.
Sure.
So I work at 350 Solutions. We're third-party verifiers for NCDR. And both Alicia and Freya touched upon this, but how do you think us verifiers are going to have to evolve and adapt over time, the industry, and what could we be doing better at this point in time in CDR? Because there's a lot of stuff I can think of, but I'm wondering what your thoughts are.
Yeah, another question that I just want to have you answer. Maybe a couple of thoughts. I think, there's a really interesting question about whether verifiers will continue to play the role of, did you check the boxes of the protocol? Whether that is the key question that they will be answering, or whether there is some deeper role for third-party verifiers that can like be subject matter expertise and like check that your ocean model makes sense. And those are like really different futures. It's not totally clear to me which of those we are headed toward.
I don't claim to know the totality of what the job is of a verifier in the traditional voluntary carbon market. So I think Freya knows more about that. You certainly know more about that. It is very, very difficult to imagine, as Freya pointed out, a world in which, when it comes to ocean-based CDR, that verifiers, if they want to stay in that game, aren't going to be really required to develop at least some expertise in terms of being able to make informed judgments and disciplinary accurate judgments about the way that people have even tried to meet the standards and the protocols, right? There just remains so much ambiguity right now, and I think that will remain there for a while, that some disciplinary expertise is likely required there.
Totally agreed.
Do you have an answer that you would want to share?
I don't know. I think I'm aligned with a lot of what you said. I think that for the time being, verifiers have been a bit wary of getting into these models, just because there's a lot to do already of checking the boxes of the parameters that we're going to use to verify this, like to check these models. So I think that's where we stand right now. But eventually, I definitely think we're going to have to verify the models themselves. So yeah.
I mean, I guess maybe one last kind of fuzzy thought, which is, eventually I hope we're in a world where we can separate a little bit more the science and the accounting, and maybe verification, those two, and processes for building consensus and trust. Like, obviously there's a very close handoff, but what does it look like to have a process that is really scientifically grounded about like establishing trustworthy models and checking them, and credit issuance processing that looks a lot more like financial auditing? I wonder if that separation starts to happen. It seems like it would be positive to me, because I think there's some really different challenges around kind of those different aspects of verification, but that's speculation.
Yep. Agreed.
Thank you all. And thank you once again to your audience for really having, again, an excellent set of comments and discussions in the chat. And thank you for your questions. Thank you to Freya and Alicia for your time today as speakers. And thank you, Rick, for moderating the conversation. For future reference, we weren't able to get to all the questions today, but I put Alicia's, Freya's, and Rick's email addresses in the chat today, so you can contact them if you wish. Also, our post-event survey. We would like to know, how can we make our Air Miners events better? What, any feedback you have, good, bad, indifferent, we want to hear from you so that we can serve you, our audience, best and advance the practice of removing greenhouse gases from the atmosphere. So with that, I just want to say thank you. Our next event is going to be our town hall in early June. So June 7th is the date for it. So be on the lookout for an invite that will go out soon for that. And until then, I wish you happy carbon removal. And one other thing, if you're a buyer or an investor of carbon removal credits and you're on this call, there are our investor demo day and buyer demo day coming up in early June as well. So I'm going to share that in the chat for you, in two links, one for investor and one for buyer, for our Launchpad team. So one is for investor, one is for buyer, sharing now. And if you're an accredited investor, if you are a carbon credit buyer, we'd love for you to come to those virtual events so that we can hear more from so that you can hear from our Launchpad teams as they are ready to speak with you. So with that, thank you, and we'll see you next time.